So, welcome, Andrea. Thank you so much for joining us on the show, the xMonks Drive. Such a pleasure having a master on this show.
Oh, thank you so much. I so appreciate being here. Thank you for having me.
So, Andrea, let's jump into directly to know about Andrea, the master coach who trains and coaches people who step on the platform of TEDx. Not an easy job to do, I'm sure. Before we even get there, I have a question. I've heard you saying that you are not at all an extrovert. You have learned to be. What does that
Mhm.
mean?
So, I'm an introvert. I am when I do any of those personality profiling tests, what always comes back is that I am as far an introvert as you can possibly be. But now when you look at me, here I sit before you with pink hair and, big glasses and lots of gregarious features. I look like an extrovert. And truthfully, most of my life, I have been in roles and jobs where I have had to be an extrovert, where I am the go to person, where I'm the storyteller, where I'm the one on stage. Um, and this is not an easy place for an introvert because when you think about introverts and extroverts, the real biggest difference. Most people think it's like, oh, well, an extrovert's the life of the party, and an introvert is the one in the corner shying away from everything. And while that may be a little bit true, what's actually more true about introverts and extroverts is it's the way in which we think. And
Hmm,
when I first understood this, it made so much sense. You see, extroverts think out loud. Extroverts have that verbalization of everything that's coming into their brain comes out of their mouth. And that's the way in which they process. Whereas an introvert, we take in, we take in, we take in, we take in, we say very little. And then when we speak in full sentences
hmm,
and full thoughts or full strategies. And so what would happen, I mean, my background is advertising. So you can imagine I would be in a room full of people who are all highly creative, who are all motivated and driven and strong personalities. And we would be doing things like brainstorming and creative problem solving. And everybody would be jumping in with an idea, and I'd be sitting in the back
hmm.
with no input until the end of it. And then I would take what everybody else has said and turn it into something usable. And it used to be that I would sit in the back of the room and go, "Oh my God, I have nothing to contribute. Oh my God, I've got nothing." And it was really difficult. And it wasn't until I really understood that I had to work with my way of thinking in order to be of service in that room. And so I started to learn how to work with extroverts. But
Hmm,
then I also learned how to act like an extrovert. I still am not a verbal thinker. I don't think out loud.
mhm.
But what I do know is that I can work with those who do in such a way that I can take their input and help them. So it's not that I'm taking what they're saying, it's that I'm repeating what they're saying in such a way that they hear it differently and I hear it differently, and so does the room. So that's a learned behavior. Another learned behavior was being on a stage. I don't like being on a stage. I don't like being the person that everybody is looking at.
Hmm.
But I know that in order to deliver the value that I have, the mastery that I have, that's part of the role. And so I step into it and I find the persona. So for me, part of what I do, if I have to be on stage or be anywhere, is that I've got that part of me that I can step into. The idea is to create your alter ego. And when I step on stage, that's who I am. And who like there's some very famous people who do this. Beyonce, as an example, she has her alter ego of Sasha Fierce. Now, Beyonce is, in fact, another introvert. Would
Hmm,
we believe it's an introvert? No, we don't, because look at her. She's Beyonce.
hmm.
But when she's performing, she's not Beyonce. She's Sasha Fierce. And so that's what I do.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrea, for sharing that. Andrea, now, so you uh, drive Singularity University in Canada. You're a part of TEDx community in Canada. You run your own organization. You work with leaders to become better communicators. There's so much that you're involved in. There are so many projects that you're involved in. So if you were to let people know what you do, How do you position yourself?
When people ask me what I do, or sort of like, what is it that that you're really I guess the master of, and really what I am is a storyteller. I'm an expert storyteller, and I'm a translator. What I mean by that is that I help others translate their ideas of who and what they are and what they want to do.
Hmm.
And I help translate that in a way that others can understand it. And I learned this about myself many years ago when I was in advertising.
Hmm.
I've always sort of straddled two worlds. So if you think of TEDx or even Singularity, these are worlds that tend to encroach upon technical, scientific, academia, right? They're highly technical worlds, and yet it's mainstream, right? They've been really good at being able to take these technical things and bring them into the mainstream in such a way that we understand it. Well, that's sort of what happened for me early on in my career. I was working in advertising, a creative industry, but advertising has become highly technical. And it started to happen in the mid 90s. And I was working in advertising at the time. And I had a real penchant for technology. And I love tech, in the early days of tech. Like, I'm one of those early adopters. I've been on the internet, whatever it was in those days, since the mid 90s. And so what happened was I was delving into the area of data and understanding the power of data. In fact, at one point in my career, I owned a data company. And and with that, I understood the technologists who were in fact working on the data. But I also was highly creative, and I worked with creative people. And so what I became was the translator between the data and tech guys and the creative teams. I could speak both languages fluently, and I could help them understand what each needed from the other. And so this translation ability, which just came natural to me, kind of evolved over time. And when I got involved in TED, that's when I started to understand that it was translation, but it was
Hmm.
also storytelling,
Yeah.
because that's what I was actually doing. I was telling stories to either group in language they could understand. And so the translation piece is really, really interesting.
I love it when you said that I can understand it, you can understand it, and others can understand it. So before we dig deeper into your understanding of the way you chisel and you carve the speaker out of an individual, just curious, from advertisement to for teaching students who were older than you, and then from that space to now leading an organization. Tell me more about that.
How did I go from sort of being the employee, the lecturer, to the business owner?
Yes.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's an interesting process. I think I never saw myself as an entrepreneur. I didn't grow up going, I can't wait to own my own business. In fact, for me, owning my own business seemed terrifying. It was not something I ever really envisioned myself doing. But it always seemed to be around me. When I was married, my ex-husband had several businesses, which I ended up getting involved in a peripheral way, even while I was, working full time. And then, when I went out on my own and started working, I was still working inside of agencies, but was becoming increasingly dissatisfied with what I was able to do. Because here's the thing, while I never saw myself as being an entrepreneur, what I did always see myself as was making a difference in the world. That was always really important for me. And I thought that advertising was such an amazing way for me to make a difference in the world. Here's a medium that has mass awareness. That's what it does. And I'm working with some of the largest brands in the world, those brands who have money and clout and recognition, to be able to put forward a message that, while yes, they were trying to sell more of their product, they could also do some good in the world. And so I had this belief, this idealist inside of me had this belief that I would be able to make a difference through the lens of my clients. And so that started to not be true for me anymore. I started to realize that that wasn't going to get realized, that the impact I could make in advertising was always only going to be very minimal. And it really wasn't profound enough for me. And so I started looking for other ways in which to satisfy that desire. And so I started volunteering and by chance ended up volunteering at TEDx Toronto. And, at the time, and they hired me, hired, because they still had to go through this whole interview process, but it was a volunteer position. And they hired me as a speaker's coach. I didn't know what a speaker's coach was, had never heard of it. But I thought, well, I mean, I present every day. I sometimes was presenting 5 times in a day. So I knew how to present, it wasn't an issue. But doing it TED style was a new process for me. And well, what happened there was that two things happened. One was that I learned that everything I had done in advertising as a strategist, as a sort of the planner that I was, which is the underpinnings of all creative strategy. That's what I did. Um, Prepared me to be a TED speaker coach perfectly because every talk has a core idea and every ad campaign has a core idea. And there was actually no difference between how I came to a core idea on an ad campaign than with a speaker. So that was really interesting for me. But the second thing that happened was I started to realize how deeply unhappy I was in advertising and that I needed to do something else. And so during my tenure at TEDx Toronto, I started to understand that I needed to leave advertising and do something that gave me the opportunity to make a much more direct impact in the world. And the work I'm doing at TEDx Toronto at that point in time was giving me that feeling. And I had this like desire of like, I wonder, how could I do this and get paid for it? And one of my colleagues at the time, who was volunteering as well at TEDx Toronto, said, well, we could start a company. And I was like, no, no one would pay for this. And he said, yeah, they would. And they pay well. And I'm like, really? And so he and I started Talk Boutique together. And that was in 2016. He's since left the company, but we started this company with this idea that we could actually create deep impact in the world by helping those who have complex messages that the world needs to understand and hear. And so think of TED speakers, think of Singularity faculty, but also think of the hundreds, thousands of people out there who are doing the work to impact the world. They've got their head down. Some of them are in science, some of them are in academia, some of them are in medicine, some of them are in technology, but they're doing the work. They're just not telling anyone about it. Or if they are, no one understands. And so Talk Boutique is really about being able to take those experts and what I call change makers and transform them into thought leaders by helping them to become storytellers. Because ultimately, what that is all about is finding the idea, wrapping it in story, and sharing it in a way that people enjoy.
Thank you, Andrea. Now, Andrea, there are two questions that I have. I remember during our initial conversation, you mentioned that I was an idealist in the capitalist world.
Yeah.
That is one question, because that is where, when you're talking about making a difference and directly impacting people who are doing some really good work and meaningful work, the second one is what's the process that you follow when you work with an individual to identify the core area and convert that thought into a storytelling format that sells.
So yeah, so that idea of being the idealist in the capitalist world, I think it's something that, who was it, Steve Jobs, who said, you can only connect the dots in retrospect. And I think that's what it's been for me as I look back on my time in advertising. Here I was, this idealist. I was always trying to play by the rules. I was always trying to make a difference, but live in all of the rules that were set out for me. And, the world didn't want an idealist. What that world wanted was a capitalist. You needed to, not do the right thing, but do the right thing as long as it made money for somebody. and I wanted to do the right thing. Didn't matter to me if we made money. And, hence not ever being wanting to be an entrepreneur, right? Like there it is right there, right? The idealist is like, I don't need money. Well, that's not true. Of course, we do need money. Money is the way in which our world works. That said, there's a way of doing it as an idealist. And, so I had to learn the hard way that I needed to step away from that capitalist world, and I needed to really delve deeply into what it is to be an idealist, and how being an idealist um, can can be of service in the world and be also um, be able to make money in the world. That it's okay, you can have both. And so that was a big learning for me. And truthfully, I think I learned that every day. It's not something that you learn once. You learn it every day.
Interestingly, Andrea, you use the word entrepreneur twice in the conversation. And the first time when you used that word, you said, I was not an entrepreneur. I'm just wondering, what was the sense that you were making from the word being an entrepreneur that didn't allow you to embrace that word fully and completely?
As I look back, so when I would think to myself, well, I'm not an entrepreneur, it was because of the risk, right? Like for me, having grown up in a world in the corporate world. I mean, I had spent my entire career in the corporate world. I was used to every 2 weeks, there was a paycheck that was deposited into my bank account. And I knew how much money I was going to make. And I knew the process. I knew how I could get promoted, or if I wasn't going to get promoted, I could go and get another job. And the risk of not having that, I couldn't imagine it. Like to me, wow, entrepreneurs were the bravest people in the world. I never saw myself as being that brave. And yet others did, which was, it always fascinated me. People used to say to me all the time, you've got such an entrepreneurial spirit. And I'd be like, what do you mean? Like, I don't,
Mm.
yeah, you know? But in retrospect, again, this is that dot connecting, is that I can look back and I can see that I had many of the attributes of an entrepreneur. Like I was very risk taking. Like I took lots of risks in my business, like in the work that I would do. I was always out on the leading edge. I was always the one pushing the boundaries for my clients. Like, look, we were doing email before email was really out there. We were doing full on campaigns in the 90s. Like, and there wasn't even email then. I was working with companies where we were doing, uh, variable landing pages in the 90s. Like
Wow.
this is crazy stuff, right? That's what I was always pushing boundaries and getting my clients to follow me. And so people saw that kind of tenacity and saw it as bravery. I never saw it as bravery. To me, it was like, well, you've always got to be looking at what's coming. And if everybody else is doing it, you're too late because it's done. You got to be ahead of that curve. And I guess that's an entrepreneurial, attribute as well. So I didn't see those things in myself. So I think it was the risk taking that was terrifying for me. Also, the other piece I think that I can own now, but probably wouldn't have said then, is that the idea of actually being the one in charge was terrifying
Mm.
because I always, even though I was always in senior management, like in advertising, I almost entered the career at senior management level. And I, I was never afraid of taking on responsibility.
Hmm.
But being a leader is a very different thing than leading a team, right?
Hmm.
So being a CEO, because, you know, you've got to be in front of the public. You've got to be the one
Hmm.
that's actually making all of the decisions. There's no one else to help you. And so that was another piece for me. And I would say that is something that in the last year, really, I've gotten over as I've taken on Talk Boutique, my business solely, because my partner left the business last year and I took it over fully. And, um, I was ready for. I was
Hmm.
finally ready for it, but it took me that long.
So, what shifted in this journey for you?
It really is trusting myself, trusting that that my instincts are good, that my creativity is solid, that I am able to fully make decisions and good decisions. And it it the way that that has come about has been by allowing myself to truly reflect upon the last 25 years of my career and see that I actually have always made good decisions
Hmm.
and that I am a good leader and always have been. It was me in my own way.
Just curious, Andrea, how has this complete journey changed your relationship with fear, risk taking, decision making that you're really happy about?
So, um, I think I am now much more comfortable with all of those risk taking, decision making. Um, those are things that I had to understand that I could do. And so risk taking, like I said, it was such an interesting thing. We're layered as humans, right?
Hmm,
And so I always saw myself as a risk taker.
hmm,
When I became an entrepreneur and when I started Talk Boutique with my ex-business partner, what what I saw in myself was I started taking less risk because he was very out there risky. And I started to become the risk averse person, which was like, wow, that's not me. I've never been risk averse, but it was important. And it was an important lesson for me because what I needed to understand was that there is a threshold within which we, especially as entrepreneurs, need to live. If we're all the way out there taking risks unnecessarily, what happens is we put ourselves into very precarious positions. But if we don't take enough risk, we don't grow.
hmm.
And so I learned that lesson and I learned my own threshold for risk. And so I am not as risky as I was with other people's money, interestingly.
Hmm.
Um, but I'm but I'm more risky than I ever have been in my own business. I am taking risks. I am understanding the direct correlation between risk taking and growth. And that was a really important lesson to learn.
So, today, as you stand on that vantage point and look back, what are the top three lessons that you've learned for yourself?
So, number one, take care of yourself. And I think this has been a hard lesson for me. I have always taken care of everyone else, taken care of the business, taken care of all the things that needed to be taken care of.
Hmm,
And this past year, with all of the challenges that we've had with a global pandemic, with changes in the business environment, with impacts at a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint, with sustainability, what I've learned is that if I don't take care of me, there's none of me to be able to give to all of those things because I have a lot to give in those areas. So, having a consistent routine that includes things like meditation and writing and looking at myself through the lens of truth and kindness, those have been incredibly important and the payoff on them is massive. So that's number one.
hmm,
Number two, I'm a good leader. And I lead with heart, I lead with strength, and I lead with vision. And, those are the pieces of integrity that I think are really important. Integrity is one of those words that people often misunderstand because integrity simply means that I align to my own values.
hmm,
And so I have had to learn what my values are and then to align to them. And I can truly say that I have because I do believe in all of the things that I've said today.
hmm,
And my actions and um, my intentions align to those values.
hmm. I
And
love
then
it
the
when you
third,
say attention and intentions are aligned with your values.
it's
Beautiful.
and it has to be, right? And then the third thing that I've learned, so what would be the third thing I've learned out of this past year? I've learned that you have to be flexible.
Hmm,
Flexibility is incredibly important. Flexibility is again, another word that I like to play with because I think the flexibility isn't just in, oh, we all pivoted. The
Mm,
flexibility is I have to relearn so much of what I've known for my entire career. And so I have to be flexible enough to be curious. And I have to be flexible enough to
mm,
be open. And I have to be flexible enough to say, I don't know the answer.
mm.
And those are really hard things, but they're all part of the flexibility that I have to have as a leader in a world in massive change.
And the first one is when you talk about is self-love, then you are a good leader and you know that. And the third one is flexibility. As a coach to few of the best speakers, and you work with corporate executives to handle media, you train and coach people on how to handle conversations, how to be a good storyteller. What does expression mean to you?
Expression is so that's a really layered word, right? It's another word. Like I love language, right? Because language, you know, language is one of those things that really defines our culture.
Hmm,
And when we start to deconstruct how we use language, right? And so expression is one of those words that has so many layered meanings. So first of all, it's how do you express? How do you actually speak? So how are you expressing what it is you want to convey in the world? But it's also expressing how you feel. So there's the what you mean, and then there's the how you feel. And for me, true expression comes when you can create, again, an alignment between what you're saying and how you're feeling.
hmm,
When I'm working with, speakers and senior leaders, this is the piece that really is the difference between somebody who's good and somebody who's great. And what I mean by that is that, and especially in the corporate world, because in the corporate world, we're taught your feelings don't belong at work, which, by the way, is the biggest load of BS that anyone ever said, because your
hmm.
feelings absolutely do belong no matter where you are,
Yeah.
because they are the guidance system that allows us to traverse a very multi layered world.
Hmm,
So when I'm speaking with a corporate executive, what I'm helping them to do is to use vocalizations and language that matches what they want to express from
hmm,
a feeling standpoint. But what I'm also doing is getting them to feel it. And so I'll do exercises with them where I'm dropping them into their body and then dropping them into their heart so that they
hmm,
can feel it. And it's not comfortable because they've been trained to not do that.
hmm.
So many of our leaders are really just a whole lot of talking heads. Like they're literally
Yeah.
heads without bodies, right? Because they live in their brain. I read a lot on this subject. And one of the things about language that I think is so interesting, I worked with a semiotics professor, semiotics being the study of language, a few years back on one of the TED events that I worked on. And he did this entire talk, which I thought was fascinating, on the origins of language. And the thesis of his talk was
Hmm.
that language is a failed human experiment.
Okay.
And he gave us he took us on this journey from cave drawings, millennia ago, the cave drawings that we found, all the way to the present day emojis. And he shows how we are returning to cave drawing. And what he was talking about was the fact that, you know, why humans began to create these drawings or create, put something down was to codify what they were experiencing and what they were feeling, right? Because
Hmm,
that's really what the cave drawings were. They always had it was a picture, but it was a picture of a hunt
yeah.
or of a ceremony or something. So you got the sense of emotion, right? And as we became more verbal, what happened is that the emotion started to leave our language. And especially, when we went into writing, because writing became the emotion, like verbal, we could still put emotion with it, but writing, suddenly that's where the emotion started to get cleared out of it. Now, there's lots of emotional writing, don't get me wrong, but it's the place where we started to really strip emotion from it. And so that emotional piece, we've been trained for hundreds of years to keep just the facts, man, just the facts. And that is, again, one of the worst fallacies in our culture, because it's
Got
not
it.
just because I could be speaking to you in one language and you could be speaking in another. And we may not understand a word that each other says, but we could make ourselves understood.
Mhm.
How? Because it's actually the emotion that we're listening for. Do you know the TV show Friends?
Yes, yes.
So it's a great example of using emotional cues. So
Mm.
you could literally turn off the sound on Friends and just watch them, and you would be able to understand what was going on in those scenes
The exchange
because
of the emotions.
they're using, yeah, because they're using such physical language, right? It's all they're expert actors at physical communications. And so they're using, because it's acting, they're using actually exaggerated forms. And so you could, and often people do, like in different languages, still understand what is being said. So that emotional conveyance happens through body, not through words. And so when I'm working with senior executives or with speakers, that's what I'm working with them on, is where's the alignment, the congruence between the words you're saying, the voice you're using, the tone, the pace, the inflections, and the way in which you're using your body. Because when you have a congruence between
Yeah,
those three things, that's where your audience believes you,
yeah.
because that's what we're talking about, because that's authenticity, right? We naturally are congruent in all three of those things when we are just telling a story or being ourselves. As soon as we're put into an artificial situation, like a stage presentation or a boardroom presentation or the corporate, sort of earnings call, we go into this artificial place of I have to be this other thing. And then we have to learn how to bring the congruence back, because there's the fear that if we express incorrectly,
Yeah,
that others won't believe us, right?
yeah.
But when the congruence is there, you don't have to worry about that.
So, since you're talking about congruence and you're talking about alignment, and that's a question that I asked you, in fact, what is the process that you follow when you work with TEDx speakers? So,
Yeah.
how do you help people to go through that complete process? Because, 8 out of 10 times, you might come across people who are not even clear about their core idea.
I would say 10 out of 10 times.
So,
They're never clear on their core idea. It's the hardest thing to actually do. So over the years, I've developed something that I call the Talk Canvas, which is a framework to build out a talk that uses a combination of story narrative, idea, and messaging that supports it. So when we talk about a TED Talk, I think we can all agree that what a TED Talk is it's an idea wrapped in a story told through the lens of support and fact. And so the first thing you have to do is come up with your idea. Well, an idea is really three things. An idea is comprised of a point,
mhm,
the activation of that point, sorry, the a topic, a point, and a passion. Okay, it's a what, a how, and a why. So the what is your topic. It's the thing you want to talk about. So from an ideas perspective, what is the idea that you want to talk about? Just topically.
yeah.
Those are
It could be
nouns.
any idea. It could be robotics, it could be
And
artificial intelligence, it could
that's
be
right. That's
genetics,
right.
it could be anything, right? Okay.
And if I take a really easy example that probably most people know, it would be the Dr. Martin Luther King "I Have a Dream"
Yeah.
speech. So that talk, the topic on that would be freedom, because that's what Dr. King. I mean, he said over and over again, "I have a dream," but his dream was freedom,
Hmm.
right? That was what it was, and so his topic was freedom. His the point is the activation of that. How do you activate that point in such a way that others will want to work with you or be a part of that?
Yeah.
um, And so in that regard, that it's the verbs. So where the topic are nouns, the how, the point are verbs. If we think of Dr. King's talk, it's, what is it that he had a dream of, right? He had a dream of freedom, but what was it? It was that all people were seen as equal.
Equal. Yeah.
Okay. So I have a dream that all people are seen as equals. So I want freedom for all people equally. But then what's the passion on that? The
Hmm.
why? What's the impact that that would make?
Hmm.
Well, so and this is where so your point, your topic, sorry, your how, your point is often the thing that is unique to you. That is your belief, right? So
Yeah.
the topic can be general freedom. The how is more specific to you. And when you put the how and the why together, you get an idea. And for Dr. King, that was his idea. It was very clear. And he could have stopped there, could have stopped with freedom and the need for equality for all. And that is a good idea. We can
Hmm.
all agree that is a good idea. But it's also a very head focused idea.
Yeah.
When you put with it a why, which is the impact you want to make in the world, this is where you as the speaker and the audience as the listeners connect.
Yeah.
Because this is the place where you both come to a place of agreement.
Hmm.
So for Dr. King, of course, it was to create a world in which all had freedom, right? So it was like to create the utopia, the utopian world. That's what he was trying to get us to, to that place. So when you put that all together, so if he started off by saying, imagine where we all live freely and equally, because what
Hmm.
I believe is that when we choose freedom, where everybody is equal and free to express themselves, we have a world where where life is better than it is. So the idea there, now that was kind of rambling and not very distinct, and if I had have been working with Dr. King, although he did not need my help, he was an amazing orator, um, we would have come to a very succinct and literal idea.
Hmm.
Because here's the thing about crafting and creating an idea. When you build out your what, your how, and your why, what you want is for it to be crystal clear. You don't want it to have metaphor or any form of rhetoric inside of it, because it needs to be really clear.
Yeah.
And it's clear for you, and it's clear as a foundational piece for your talk. Once you have that, then you build on top of it.
Hmm.
Then you build all the story, all the metaphor, all of that. But you need to have the idea very, very clearly defined
Hmm.
first.
I'm sure at times it would take a little longer time than you would have expected to extract that idea from the individual that you're working with.
When we're working with TED speakers, honestly, that is the thing that takes the longest. It's not unusual for that to take 3 or 4 sessions, before we get to the core idea, because sometimes it's very complex and it's a deconstruction process, right? And so we're coming at it, coming at it, coming at it. But once you have that, everything else speeds up. It's very fast,
Hmm.
because once you have that aha moment of that's it, that's the idea.
Then you can
Now,
construct everything around that.
well, and now we can go to the story, because that's what everybody wants to start with, a story. And when you give the talk, of course you start with the story, but that's not where you write a talk. When you start writing a talk, you start with your idea first,
Hmm.
and then you build the story around it, because the story now can be so powerful. I was working with a speaker this past week, and she is a city builder. She works with technical experts, so engineers, architects, people who are, really deep technical experts in the area of cities and infrastructure. And one of the biggest challenges in cities is that um, we build these beautiful cities, but people don't use them in the way that they were constructed or intended. And why? Why are cities not used? Why do we build parks that no one goes to? And why are there, green spaces that are overused? Like, what is it about that? Well, what her argument was that we need to build social infrastructure
mm,
before we build physical infrastructure.
mm,
Now, that's a complex idea, right? What is social infrastructure?
mm.
Well, to a technical expert, social infrastructure actually has meaning, but to the rest of us, it doesn't. And so we had to break that down. And what is social infrastructure? Social infrastructure is building relationships with the people who live in the cities before you decide on what you're building for them. Because why build a park
What an
when the
amazing
people,
thought.
I know, see, isn't that amazing, right?
Yeah.
So, and I'll give you the example of like, why build a park in a at-risk neighborhood when, there's dumpsters in front of their building, and every time they walk into their place of where they reside, they're confronted with the fact that garbage sits in front of their door.
Mm,
Like, are they going to accept a park from you? No. Get rid of the garbage first.
mm,
Do the fundamentals. Have the conversation with the people who live in those neighborhoods to say, what's most important for you? And if they say, just get rid of the dumpster out of my front door, do that first, then come back to them and talk to them about
mm,
the park.
mm. Last time during our conversation, you spoke about social narrative. And right now, when you're talking about social infrastructure, that's one form of social narrative that you are creating in the society that we are a part of. And you also mentioned one of the reasons why you love working with TEDx speakers and why you really love working with Singularity University, because somewhere or the other, you are contributing to change the social narrative.
Yes.
Tell me more
Yeah.
about that, because that was the
Yes.
most fascinating idea that I got from the last conversation.
So when I started working with TED speakers many years ago, and again, I was still in advertising at the time, and I was living in a world where we were in fact impacting the social narrative. At the time, I wouldn't ever have said that, but in retrospect, I can see that now. And so you're living in a world of fact, whatever fact means. But I started working with TED speakers, and I started to see this other world that I had actually no idea existed. Here were scientists, academics, technologists who were doing the work that was actually changing our world. And I would work. I remember working with this one gentleman who was working on the worldwide the Human Genome Project, which was the project that was looking at resequencing and using the human genome. And first of all, I didn't even know that existed. I had no idea that that here we had this human genome project underway. And and then as he started to explain to me what it meant, it felt like, first of all, science fiction. And then as I started to understand how close we were on some of this stuff, I was blown away
Mm,
of what they were doing. And I go, why don't people know this? Like, I'm pretty connected. I'm always out there on the leading edge. Why don't I know this stuff? And if I knew this stuff, I might feel differently about the state of the world.
mm,
So what I started to understand was that there was this whole other world that I had no idea about. And if I had an idea about it, I might make different choices for me as an individual and
mm.
as a contributor to society. And I started to understand that our media gives us a very biased view. Now, this was many, many years ago before we had the world of fake news and all of that. And I think all of us have become much more aware of this concept that media mostly are giving us a very biased view of what's
Yeah,
happening.
it's
But what I,
creating a space so that we can start to believe in what they are asking us to
that's
consume.
it. They're giving us a false narrative. Is what
Yeah.
they're doing.
Ah.
And so what I started to see was that there was a need to create a different narrative. So if we've got one narrative that's being controlled through media, who, by the way, are often controlled by other factors, because there's lots of other factors that play into media. What if we had an unbiased? And this is where TED came in. So it was like, wow, when you start watching TED Talks, you do see a different world.
Yeah.
And I was like, what if we could do more of that? What if we could create a bigger social narrative? What if we could create the Good News Network? What if we could create the TED version, the good news version of CNN? What would that look like?
Mm,
And what if we could create that in such a way that people really started to see all the good that was happening. What would that do to the world in general? Could we start dreaming a new dream? Because, we're living a life of story. That is what we are. This is a story. We're all creating a story. So if you get to create your own story, which we all do, by the way, um, what story are you going to choose? Are you choosing the false narrative that's being given to us? Or are you choosing to see all these other amazing things that are happening in the world and
Hmm.
constructing your own?
Yeah.
And so I wanted to be able to create that other thing.
And how is it connected with the Thought Leadership Academy that you're working with now?
Yeah. So this is where it sort of comes full circle because I started Talk Boutique, which is a speakers bureau of deep subject matter experts who are storytellers telling us about the work they're doing, similar to what we see with TED. Then I started, working with, again, coaching singularity speakers, TED speakers, but also corporate executives in this model that helps us to bring that really important message forward. And then I started something called the Thought Leader Academy, because what I started to understand is that, first of all, we all have an idea. And secondly, we are all thought leaders within our communities. So, how do we choose to step up and create the narrative we want? And
Got
so,
it.
what I've done is I've created an academy of those who want to step into being a thought leader, and a thought leader who has a message that can help us construct a narrative that's more hopeful, a narrative that brings us to a place of joy and a place of hope. And that's what I want, because that's the world that I see.
That's where we will be able to tap into the unique gifts and the talents one is born with.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. So I mean, this is where it is. It's so the Thought Leader Academy, what I help people to understand about themselves is number one, everybody has a message. And so let's codify that. Let's bring it down. Let's do your what, how, why. Let's get that idea for who you are or what you want to say. Then let's find the story to wrap it in. So I teach people the narrative construction process of what it takes to do a TED Talk and how to use that TED Talk in a boardroom or on a stage or in a virtual place. So it
Beautiful.
starts there. Then it goes into the performance skills. How are you performing that? So what is your body language? What is your voice saying? How are you using your stage presence, your, eye contact, all the parts of your body that show up in such a way that you're congruent with what your narrative is saying. And then we look at, do you have visuals? Should you have visuals? What should they look like? How can they support? Because you're the star. So how can your visuals be the supporting cast? And
Yeah.
then we start looking at things like, who are you? What is your personal brand? What community are you speaking in? And how are you commanding that community?
Hmm.
And all of that comes together for you to create that thought leader within.
Yeah. So, what I'm really fascinated about is that on one hand, you're working with robotics. On the other day, you might be working with a technocraft. Yeah. And the third day, you might be working with an artificial intelligence specialist. And the fourth day, you must be working with an academic, right? How do you switch gears?
It's a very good question. I've just become good at it. I think when in the early days of Talk Boutique, and especially when we first took on Singularity University, it was difficult because I was sometimes bouncing, between robotics, AI, Bitcoin, neurobiology, neuropsychology, nanotech, future of food, future of work. Like those, sometimes that would be a day for me.
Hmm.
And so your brain starts to explode. Um, what happened, I guess from that is I've just gotten really good at it. I have what I think I have is I have a really good peripheral knowledge set. And so no matter what speaker I'm working with, I'm coming to them with nothing, first of all. I come to them as a blank slate. I don't do any work up front, and it's important for me to not do that because I need to come as an audience for them. But I've got such a broad and deep peripheral knowledge set that when I show up, no matter where they are, I have a lot to bring to that conversation so that I can guide them. So I've got obviously the skills of being a speaker's coach and understanding how to build that but I also have peripheral knowledge and wisdom that can help them even in their talk. So the shifting of gears is about me actually always showing up as that blank slate, and allowing the speaker to guide the process of what they need. And then I show up from there.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. So, if you were to give a piece of advice to yourself that will allow you to extract the best out of any subject that you might not be even aware of, what advice would you have to offer? One is you show up as a clean slate, and then you need to have an understanding or knowledge at the peripheral, right? What's the third piece of advice that you offer to yourself?
In terms of being of service, leave my ego at the door.
Hmm.
It's not about me. It's never about me. I show up as I'm a vessel. You can't hurt my feelings. Um, I am always there in support of the person I'm working with. And so that allows me to really leave that ego out of it and to recognize that everybody is going to have a different experience of me, and um, to to be curious about it as opposed to having any form of opinion about it.
So, being of service, right? And also, you spoke about being of service does not mean serving.
Mhm.
How do you juggle with these two words together? On one hand, we are talking about being of service. On the other hand, we are talking about it's not always serving.
Right. So I think one of the misconceptions around being of service is that you need to be a subordinate.
Hmm.
Serving puts you into a subordinate role. And that's not the case at all. When you are serving, what you are doing or being of service, especially at the highest level of being at service, is you are reflecting back to that person all of what they need to hear or be or see. And so sometimes being of service is having difficult conversations.
Hmm. Hmm.
Sometimes being of service is doing things that you wouldn't do normally,
Yeah.
but it's understanding that you need to be of service in the highest version of yourself. You are not subordinating yourself. You step into all of your power and you show up in service.
This reminds me, I was working with one of the leaders in India, and this gentleman who's the chairman of one of the conglomerates in the country, he said something so beautiful. Kindness does not always mean that you will speak to the other person politely. At times, you might have to challenge him or her. That's also kindness.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, that is absolutely true. That, you know, there's a song, you have to be cruel to be kind. Now, you don't always have to be cruel to be kind.
Yeah.
Sometimes you do. Um, and, and I mean, for me, I try never to be cruel because I think you don't have to be. But what that's really saying is that being in truth, or
Yeah.
whatever, because again, truth is subjective, but my truth or what I'm hearing. So, as an example, would it be kind for me to allow somebody to go onto stage who wasn't ready? Would that be kind of me? No,
No.
it would not. And that person might think they're ready, and that person may believe that they have something that they need to share.
Yeah.
And if I, in my professional opinion, listen to it and say, you need work, I need to say that to that person and give them enough to be able to go into that stage with confidence that because a person who is walking out onto a stage becomes very vulnerable. And if they're not ready for it, that can be devastating, and it'll take them a long time to come back from that.
Yeah.
So sometimes I've got to pull them back and go, you're not ready for that. Or here's what you can do in this moment to be ready in that particular, but you're not 100% yet. So let's be clear that this, we're going to go out, you're going to do this as a pilot, you're going to approach it as a learning experience. The audience will react how the audience is going to react. It's okay. Okay, I'm here with you. We're going to deconstruct it afterwards, and we'll figure out how to get you to the next step.
Precisely.
That's
So, as
fun.
they say, that gifts might not always appear like gifts.
That's
Yeah.
right. That's right.
So, here's the last question, Andrea. Now, just imagine that everything is taken away from you, all your skill sets, the name that you have earned for yourself, the reputation that you have, the authority that you have, and above all, even your name has been taken away from you. How would that be for you?
Big question. Um, I mean, it's hard to even imagine, right? Because you take everything away. I think for me, at the core of who we all are a set of values, and really that's all we have. And so no one can ever take your values away from you. And so, I truly do believe in making a difference in the world. I believe in um, helping and supporting. I believe in creating and building. Um, and being intensely curious. And those things would still be true of me. It doesn't matter what my name is. It wouldn't matter what my experience was. I would probably still be asking questions and probably annoying people, quite frankly, because I would be asking way too many questions. Um, and that's who I am, and that would always be true of me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrea. Uh, I
Thank
think
you. It's
when you're
been
saying that
amazing.
you'll always be true to your values and that will remain true for you always, irrespective of the name, the fame, the authority, anything that you have is, even if that is taken away from you, something is left with the essence that we all operate from. So I think it was a fantastic conversation with you, Andrea. Loved every single minute. I think the complete conversation was full of wisdom and experience coming from you and through you. So thank you so much for being our guest and look forward to our interaction soon.
Well, thank you so much. This has been really, really an honor and so much fun. Thank you.